None of Brenda Gaddis's friends or family could have guessed that Thanksgiving 1990 would be the last time they'd see the sweet 33-year-old mother of three. For weeks, it seemed like Brenda had vanished into thin air, but eventually finding her just led to more questions that are still unanswered to this day. Dayton, Ohio was fighting hard to keep the harsh Midwest winter away in December of 1990. The whole month was unseasonably warm, and Wednesday, the 12th, was no exception, with temperatures hovering between 50 and 60 degrees. So two local salvagers, a man and a woman in their 30s, decided to take advantage of the warm weather and scour their neighborhood for aluminum cans littered to the side of the road that they could turn in for cash. Guthrie Road, a twisting, turning street on the city's southwest edge, had all the elements of a can-hunting gold mine. It's pretty rural feeling, with a slight ditch on either side. Directly to the south is a big landfill, and on both sides of the road the ditch is lined with thick underbrush, perfect for holding on to all kinds of aluminum treasures. As the salvagers were scouring the dense brush, though, something caught their eye. Some kind of large object lying beneath all the branches. When the object came into focus, they were horrified to realize that what they were staring at was the nude body of a deceased woman. Since the salvagers lived close by, they rushed home and immediately phoned police, who were quick to show up. They followed the pair to the location and immediately got to work roping off the area. Now retired Detective Doyle Burke, who responded to the scene that day, explained the challenges they faced. In thick underbrush like this, investigators have to painstakingly approach a piece at a time as they near the body. They can't just rush in and grab the body. Even from a distance, it was clear that the woman hadn't died at that location. It looked like she'd been placed there, and a while ago, based on the level of decomposition. But those weren't the only things investigators made note of right out of the gate. Detective Burke noted that she had a gold-colored necklace on and a diamond ring. This was a clue that pointed away from robbery as a motive. If this was a robbery, the perpetrator would have taken the ring and the necklace. Going to all trouble to transport this body somewhere and having time to take those items, it didn't make sense to leave valuable jewelry behind. So investigators tended to think that might not be the reason. Also of interest for detectives was what wasn't on the woman's body: clothing. The lack of clothing was evidence in and of itself. The fact that the killer took time to disrobe her, transport her, but not take anything of value suggested it was almost like someone that was familiar with her in some form. As detectives got closer to the woman, they didn't see any obvious injuries like a gunshot wound or anything that pointed toward a cause of death. There also weren't any clues around the body that suggested a cause of death. In fact, there wasn't much for authorities to collect from the scene at all, aside from documenting some suspicious tire tracks that they found on the road. There were tire treads, basically, on the asphalt. They were black marks where you could make out the tread of the tires, and they were adjacent to where the body was thrown into the ditch. That could be the suspect vehicle. Obviously, the evidence crews documented them and diagrammed them. The problem with things like that is they're pretty general tires. There are thousands of cars this fits. Unless investigators get the vehicle and can show that this one's worn on the left side or has individual wear characteristics, it's to be documented and retained. But it's not a go-get-them-tomorrow type of lead. After processing the scene, police moved to canvassing the area. But it's kind of a more rural part of town. Not totally remote, but definitely not a big business hub or super residential area. This was back before even businesses had cameras. Businesses are not on the roadway. They set way back. They've got long driveways. There are no close residences. There's not a whole lot of people to talk to. It's traveled just well enough to where a car at night parked by the side of the road there while they dispose of a body, nobody's going to pay attention to it. The investigation was going nowhere fast, but it wouldn't be long before authorities' biggest question was answered. Even though the woman was pretty decomposed, the coroner was able to rehydrate her fingers enough to lift her prints, which quickly came back as a match for 33-year-old Brenda Gaddis, who, as it turns out, died from blunt force trauma to the head. The injury was basically right on the left side of the head, just around the earlobe and a little above. Blunt force trauma injury could be from a pipe, could be from a bat, could be from a bat, could be from a stick. Other than the trauma to her head, Brenda didn't appear to have many other injuries. There were some slight abrasions on her legs, but it was undetermined if those were pre- or post-mortem. There were also no defensive injuries, according to Detective Burke, although there is some source material that does note she looked to have put up a fight. And surprisingly, there was no evidence of sexual assault. Once the autopsy was completed, authorities notified next of kin, Brenda's father and mother, James and Ida Gaddis. Of course, they were heartbroken, but they'd suspected for a while that something was wrong. No one had seen or heard from Brenda since Thanksgiving, a whole 3 weeks prior, which was totally unlike her. They told police that Brenda was a person with substance use disorder and had been experiencing homelessness for some time, but she wasn't living on the streets. She was more couch surfing, jumping between friends and relatives' homes. The family was very open about what she did. The narcotics officers didn't know anything about where she would get drugs or anything like that. They kind of separated themselves from that part. They knew that she would turn to sex for money at some points in time or drugs, but she wasn't a steady sex worker. But still, Brenda's life didn't have the same unpredictability that sometimes accompanies a high-risk lifestyle. She was reliable and visited her 3 young children, who lived with Ida regularly. But they told police that after a day of Thanksgiving festivities with the family, she just vanished. Brenda's fiancé Donald confirmed James and Ida's timeline. He hadn't seen Brenda since Thanksgiving either. In fact, the two of them had had plans to get together the day after Thanksgiving. But Brenda was a no-show, which Donald said right away had deeply concerned him. He'd gone around and checked her usual haunts, friends' houses, Hoover Lanes, which was a bowling alley in Dayton that Brenda had worked at on and off, but he couldn't find her anywhere. Donald told investigators that once his searches turned up nothing, he went right to the police station to report Brenda missing. But as police pointed out to Donald at the time, Brenda was a full-fledged adult. She had every right to just up and leave if she wanted to. And that, combined with her high-risk lifestyle, meant law enforcement didn't file an official missing persons report. Donald said they did, however, write up a complaint memo. A complaint memo is basically just a formal way to document an incident that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a crime. That alerts street crews and detectives that this person is missing. She's not an endangered missing person. She doesn't have some disability, Alzheimer's, or something like that where you'd see more urgent action. A report's made, but it's not something that's actively being worked on. It's general knowledge, general information. No one's assigned to it. No one is actively looking for her or anything. Well, no one official, but her family and friends were certainly keeping an eye out. But now their search had come to a gut-wrenching end, and all they could do now was fully cooperate with the investigation. Everybody the investigators talked to was asked if they minded if police looked around. Maybe she left something there, and everybody was cooperative. There was nothing there that anyone would say would be helpful, and she really didn't keep a whole lot of things anywhere. After leaving those searches empty-handed, investigators explored another path. Maybe Brenda's murder was related to her sex work. They tried to track down some of her clients, but there was no luck on that front. She didn't run a regular route or anything like that. It was a matter of convenience. If the offer came up and she could use a little extra money, that's what she would do. Nothing was panning out for detectives, but as with most murder investigations, it wasn't long before there were some rumors popping up. A friend that Brenda had stayed with on and off told police that she'd heard gossip about Brenda for a while, particularly allegations that she'd been stealing. Investigators heard that she may have been taking some money from people or she owed people money, but it wasn't like they knew she owed John $400 and she was supposed to pay it. There was nothing to follow up on there. It was a possible motive, and they wouldn't discount it. But if you owe money, why wouldn't you take the chain and the diamond ring too? It seemed unlikely, but there also wasn't much that seemed likely at this point either. And before they knew it, investigators had run out of threads to follow. There was no bright shining star suspect that they could go get first. They didn't have any suspects, and they didn't really even have a promising direction, to be honest. They knew how she died, but why did she die? They didn't even have that motive at that point in time. Not that you need that, but it's helpful in trying to figure out who did it. But when one door closes, another opens. Soon enough, investigators began connecting the dots and found that Brenda's case fit the same MO as a few other murders in and around Dayton. It started off with just a few cases on the list, but over the following years, the count rose to nearly a dozen cases that spanned from 1985 to 1992. all with striking similarities. All the victims were known or suspected sex workers. They were small in stature and between the ages of 26 to 36. All but one were black women. 6 of them were killed elsewhere and their bodies dumped. 8 of the victims were nude or partially disrobed when their bodies were discovered, and most had been sexually assaulted. Police didn't think literally every single one of those murders was committed by the same person, but they thought maybe smaller groups within that list were victims of the same killer. So they began identifying which cases were the most similar to one another, and they ended up loosely connecting Brenda with 3 other cases. Detective Burke asked that the victims' names not be used because other agencies are involved and he wants to respect their investigations. Out of the 4 victims, Brenda was the first to be murdered. Remember, she was found on December 12, 1990. Next was a woman found on December 14, 1991, a year almost to the day after Brenda was found. This woman was nude, beaten to death, and dumped about 4 miles from where Brenda was located. That same day, the next victim was found. She was dumped just west of Dayton in a vacant trailer park. This woman was fully clothed, and her cause of death was blunt force trauma. The last victim was found about 6 months later in June of 1992. Her body dumped just north of Dayton proper. She'd been struck in the head and had a plastic bag tied around her head as well. They were all dumped in similar manner, killed in similar manner. They weren't all close in proximity, but they were close enough. Obviously, you're transporting somebody by vehicle, so the fact that it's not within a mile of each other or anything is really not a big concern. So pretty similar circumstances across the board, all within a year and a half of each other. But it was all speculation. None of these cases had been solved or even had viable suspects. So it's not like there was a promising person of interest to look into as a serial killer. Still, Brenda's case possibly being connected to these other 3 victims remained law enforcement's best and maybe only lead for quite some time. But that's all they had, just this theory. That is until 26. That's when Dayton PD's cold case unit dusted off Brenda's file and decided to send a few items from evidence off for DNA testing. And lo and behold, they got a profile. Her right fingernail scrapings had unknown male DNA underneath them. The cold case unit was ecstatic. They finally had some useful, tangible evidence, so they got busy. They ensured their DNA profile was entered into the local and state databases, but it wasn't a good enough sample to be entered into NDIS, the national level of CODIS. The state databases were better than nothing, but when they uploaded it, there were no immediate hits. So next upon their list was testing the DNA against key people from the investigation. Everyone willingly provided their DNA, and no one was a match, pretty much eliminating them from any current or future suspect list. Regarding cross-checking the newfound DNA in Brenda's case with any of those cases from 1985 to 1992, Detective Burke said, yes, in some of those cases, they were able to collect vaginal swabs, fingernail scrapings, etc. And they have a good DNA sample. But Burke also said that with the victims being known or suspected sex workers, that actually kind of muddied the waters, especially for vaginal swabs. Sure, the DNA could be from the killer, but it very well could have been from one of their clients. And with DNA testing still being a relatively new process that took a lot of time, investigators just weren't ready to go down that rabbit hole yet. Instead, another rabbit hole popped up in the form of a tip, maybe the most promising one they'd received yet. The tipster who came forward, called Noah, recalled to police a vivid memory he had from his childhood in 1990, one involving his stepfather, called Ryan. Noah reported that his stepfather, Ryan, would sometimes pick up sex workers and take them to the basement of their residence. He would see this intermittently, and he remembered on Thanksgiving that he had heard a woman screaming. Noah claimed that the following day, he witnessed something even more disturbing. When his stepfather was taking them to school in their car, he noticed a hand sticking out from underneath a quilt that was rolled up in the back of the car, like an old hatchback-type car. Thanksgiving, 1990. Right away, investigators made the connection that maybe this was Brenda. But there was one thing off about Noah's story. Noah claimed Ryan was taking him and his siblings to school the day after Thanksgiving, when there is no school. But it was easy to give Noah the benefit of the doubt. Again, he's recalling this traumatic event 16 years later, and he would have been only 9 or 10 when he witnessed it. So maybe he was just misremembering that part. Before jumping to any conclusions, though, police wanted to talk to Noah's siblings, two sisters, basically to see if their memory of the day lined up. Siblings would not confirm anything like that occurred. Odd, for sure, but they weren't fully questioning Noah's credibility just because of that. Memory's a funny thing, and maybe the sisters had just forgotten or weren't wanting to speak up. But the more investigators looked into Noah, the less confident they grew. The detectives researched it and found out through the court that their informant Noah had mental health issues. Mental health issues is such a broad term. There's a big difference between an informant struggling with generalized anxiety disorder and an informant who suffers from a personality disorder associated with pathological lying. But Detective Burke said they didn't know. They actually couldn't know. Unfortunately, that stuff is guarded from them. They can't just call up and ask what he has. Dementia, mental loss, schizophrenia. You can't just get that information. After that, the Noah lead fizzled. Investigators felt the lead wasn't credible enough to pursue, so they dropped it and were back to the drawing board, which is where they'd remain for a whole decade and a half until 2022. By this point, Detective Burke was retired, but he'd literally just returned to DPD on a part-time basis to help with their cold case unit. And somehow, all the stars aligned so that he was there, right as the case he assisted with in 1990 was warming back up 30-some years later. It was none other than Noah reaching back out to check on his tip from 2006, asking why anything hadn't been done about it. Retired Detective Burke sat down with Noah to hear everything straight from the source. Noah reiterated his 2006 story to Burke and was adamant that he knew where the woman was killed in their home's basement on a mattress. Burke admitted that in his contact with Noah, he didn't appear to have any mental health issues. He didn't really have anything to gain from this. Burke understood that you have to take things with a grain of salt when someone may have issues that investigators don't know the specifics of. Detective Burke and the rest of the cold case squad decided to lean into Noah's tip. It seemed promising enough, and with a case 3 decades old, they were willing to try anything. They researched the information a little bit, found out the address they would have been living at the time, because they'd since moved several times, and had Noah draw a diagram of what the basement looked like. He did, and showed where the mattress would have been and things like that. Next, investigators revisited Noah's sisters to see if they had had a change of heart or memory. They had nothing but good things to say about the stepfather. They usually went to church. Everything was positive. It was almost like they'd protested too much. You don't have to go quite that far. Just on that Thanksgiving, do you remember that? And they said they never remembered anything like that. That never happened. He has mental health issues, so investigators were right back in the same boat. But now they had an address, so they took that address and ran with it. They contacted the current resident, very helpful people, and she gave them permission to go down and search the basement. One might ask, search for what? Who knows how many other people have lived in that house since 1990, and it's literally 3 decades later. Wouldn't any forensic evidence like blood be gone by now? Well, Detective Burke said, maybe. But they recovered blood from many, many years past. Stranger things have happened. Here's how they do a search like this. They get a team and go into the room in question. They need complete darkness, so they board up all the windows. Then they spray this agent called Blue Star. Basically, it fluoresces with body fluids, especially blood. Naturally, whatever area fluoresces, that's where they collect a sample from. So that's the exact process Detective Burke's team followed the day that they went and searched the basement. And wouldn't you know it, they spotted an area that glowed. A few, actually. Authorities collected their swabs and sent them off for testing, waiting with bated breath. Of course, what they found could have been bodily fluid from anyone, but it was still cause for excitement. In the meantime, investigators returned to Noah for another chat. They didn't want to tip their hand or get his hopes up and reveal that they'd uncovered something in the search. Instead, they said they just wanted to talk about the lack of corroboration surrounding his story, how his 2 sisters didn't back him up. Noah didn't let up on his account of the day, but he did say that he misspoke on one small detail, where in the basement he believed the woman was killed. He said it was actually in a small room in the basement. A room, of course, that investigators hadn't searched during their Blue Star testing. There was laminate flooring in there, and they didn't want to rip it up, but with Noah's updated statement, they now needed to. And thankfully, the owners of the home were as cooperative as ever, and agreed to let police return for another search. So they went back. They ripped up the flooring, did the blue star testing, the whole process. But nothing fluoresced this time. That was hardly the end of the line for investigators, though, because remember, they still hadn't heard back from the lab if their swabs from the previous search contained Brenda's blood or even blood at all. These things take time. And while they were still waiting, they reached out to the man possibly behind it all. Ryan, Noah's stepfather. He's a very elderly man now. They wanted to get a DNA standard from him. If Ryan cooperated with giving the DNA sample, they could compare it to what was found under Brenda's fingernails. And they could either put this theory to bed once and for all, or possibly have cause for an arrest. They basically told him what information they had. And he said he didn't think he wanted to do that. Sketchy, right? But former Detective Burke said, sure, it could come across that way, but he can also see it in a more innocent light. It's kind of scary when the homicide police come out and say they need your DNA. The mind just goes off. They're going to put me in a database. It's going to come up to something I touched 4 years ago. And he decided he didn't think he wanted to do that. So no DNA sample from Ryan. As of today, they're still waiting to hear back from the lab on those samples from the basement. The problem is, if any of that comes back as Brenda Gaddis's, that will give them enough probable cause to get a search warrant to take a DNA standard from their suspect. Right now, they've got a guy who's saying this occurred. Other people are saying this never happened. The suspect is saying he doesn't want to give a sample, but he didn't do that. They need something else. The court is not going to give them a search warrant to say you can physically take DNA from the subject based on that. It's not just the samples from the basement that they're waiting for. Around the early 2000s, they caught wind of another guy, someone who was known to have committed somewhat similar murders in Dayton and Florida back in the day. The connection is loose at best, so they haven't looked into the guy too much for Brenda's case. But investigators are trying to compare his DNA with what they have in Brenda's to know if it's something that they should dive into further. And remember the nearly dozen other cases mentioned from the Dayton area with similarities to Brenda's? Well, some of them have usable suspect DNA. So the cold case squad wants to do a cross comparison and see if any match. Also, one of those cases was actually solved, and when police went and arrested the guy, he died by suicide. So now the cold case team needs to test his DNA against the DNA under Brenda's nails. The answer is simple, but nonetheless frustrating. They work with a state crime lab now, since their local lab quit processing DNA. So they have to set up an appointment to have the case reviewed. They're working with the whole state. And certainly the ongoing cases are much more important than a 20, 30, or 40-year-old case. So they kind of tend to take their place in line, and then it's longer to get the results back. Whether they take advantage of private lab testing or not, they've got their sights set on a different possible light at the end of the tunnel: forensic genetic genealogy. They're currently working with a DNA expert from the FBI to get that testing done, and hopefully they'll be able to build out a family tree with real results. There are so many balls in the air for Brenda's case right now, and whether or not any of them amount to anything, Burke thinks that justice is close. He's sitting there just happy as he could be that they have unknown male DNA underneath her fingernails. That gets them in the doorway, but it's a very big room they're entering. Big as that room may be, DPD hopes that answers are right around the corner. The case of Brenda Gaddis represents both the persistent challenges of investigating crimes involving vulnerable populations and the evolving power of forensic science to breathe new life into decades-old investigations. When Brenda's body was discovered in that Dayton ditch in December 1990, investigators faced the familiar obstacles that often complicate cases involving individuals living high-risk lifestyles, limited reliable witnesses, transient associates, and societal biases that sometimes diminish the urgency of the investigation. Yet Detective Burke and his colleagues demonstrated remarkable persistence, methodically documenting evidence, following leads, and maintaining hope even when the case seemed to reach dead ends. The preservation of crucial DNA evidence from beneath Brenda's fingernails would prove prescient, becoming the cornerstone of renewed investigative efforts decades later. The potential connection to a serial killer targeting sex workers in the Dayton area during the late 1980s and early 1990s underscores the broader pattern of violence that vulnerable women often face. These cases, with their striking similarities in victim profile, disposal methods, and geographic clustering, suggest a predator who specifically targeted women he perceived as easy victims, less likely to be immediately missed or thoroughly. Investigated. Noah's testimony presents one of the most intriguing aspects of the case, the delayed revelation of childhood trauma that may hold the key to solving Brenda's murder. His detailed account of witnessing his stepfather's alleged crimes, while complicated by questions about his mental health and the lack of corroboration from his siblings, has provided investigators with their most concrete lead in decades. The Blue Star testing of the basement, while not yielding definitive results, demonstrates how modern forensic techniques can be applied to investigate historical claims. Ryan's refusal to provide a DNA sample, while legally within his rights, certainly raises questions about what he might be trying to hide. His advanced age adds urgency to the investigation, as the window for obtaining answers from him may be limited. The ongoing laboratory analysis of samples collected from the basement search could provide the probable cause needed to compel a DNA sample, potentially breaking the case wide open. The broader investigative approach, including DNA comparisons with other unsolved cases and the pursuit of forensic genetic genealogy, reflects the comprehensive strategy needed for complex cold cases. Each avenue of investigation increases the chances that some piece of evidence will finally provide the breakthrough that brings Brenda's killer to justice. For Brenda's 3 children, now adults who have lived most of their lives without their mother, and for James and Ida Gaddis, who lost their daughter in such a brutal way, the investigation represents more than just police work. It's a continuing search for closure and justice that has spanned more than 3 decades. Detective Burke's return to work on the case he originally investigated demonstrates the personal investment that dedicated law enforcement officers develop in unsolved cases. His optimism about having DNA evidence as a starting point reflects the reality that in modern investigations, science often provides the answers that traditional detective work cannot achieve alone. As the various DNA tests and genealogical analyses proceed, the case stands at a potential turning point. Whether through laboratory results, witness cooperation, or forensic genealogy breakthroughs, the tools now available to investigators offer genuine hope that Brenda Gaddis will finally receive the justice she deserves. After 33 years of unanswered questions, the convergence of preserved evidence, advancing technology, and renewed investigative focus may finally provide the answers that have remained elusive for so long. It's been nearly 33 years, and that's long enough for the truth about what happened to Brenda Gaddis to finally emerge.